What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome back to Casually Competitive MTG, where it's our goal to bring you some semi-competitive EDH gameplay content that's both fast-paced and entertaining, and boy, do we got a doozy for you today. But before we get into the opening hands and deck introductions, I want to just do a few quick channel promotions just to let you guys know of a few things. First off, we now have a Patreon. If you want to support us financially to allow us to improve the quality of the videos and bring you more videos similar to this one, links in the description. I think you'll really enjoy the reward tiers we have set up for you if that's something you're looking to do. Secondly, we now have a Discord. If you want to come and join and talk to us or just be a part of the community, links in the description if you want to go ahead and join. But that's enough of the promotions. Let's introduce the decks we have for you today. Going first, we have Bill playing Godo, Bandit Warlord. This mono red deck looks to do one thing, and that one thing is ramp. Ramp hard, ramp fast, just never stop ramping until you hit the mana requirement to play Godo, tutor up Helm of the Host to the battlefield, and then equip it by either paying the mana cost or using something like a Hammer of Nazan to auto-equip it, and then going to combat with Godo having Helm of the Host, and just take infinite combat steps. His opening hand today contained 7 cards, and those cards were an Inventor's Fair, a Snow-Covered Mountain, a Cavern of Souls, a Sequestered Stash, a Captain Lannery Storm, a Sweltering Suns, and a Krark Clan Ironworks. Going second today, we have Nate playing Zur the Enchanter. This Zur deck looks to use Zur's ability to tutor out something like a Necropotence to keep his hand full so he can control the board until he gets something like a Demonic Consultation to exile his library and a Laboratory Maniac type effect in order to win the game. His opening hand today contained an Adarkar Wastes, a City of Brass, a Mana Confluence, a Soul Ring, a Swan Song, a Cursed Totem, and then he put a Pull from Eternity to the bottom of his deck due to the London Mulligan. Going third today, we have Joseph playing Hullen, Teller of Tales. I am changing the pronunciation slightly compared to what I said last time, but I did want to give a quick explanation on why I am pronouncing it the way I am. Based on the information that I've found, this name stems from a character in Irish mythology whose name is Cuchulainn. I believe, if said correctly, there is a little bit of an inflection at the beginning of Hullen and also a pause in between those two, but just for comfort's sake, I'm going to stick to just Hullen. Sorry about any confusion. Anyway, this Bant deck looks to put together a creature-based combo using something like a Mana Breach or a Cloudstone Curio in order to constantly bounce and replay cheap creatures, drawing cards with Hulin's ability in order to draw their entire library and eventually win with one of the many combos. If you're curious on what the list of all of the combos in, the deck list for this video is in the description with all of the combos listed out there. His opening hand today contained a Plains, an Island, a Windswept Heath, a Carpet of Flowers, a Flusterstorm, a Stony Silence, and a Smothering Tithe. And going last today, we have Jordan playing Azami, Lady of Scrolls. This mono blue deck looks to play Azami early and then play a lot of wizards to go along with it in order to constantly get card draw in order to assemble a combo that allows him to untap his wizards, so something like a Dramatic Reversal Isochron Scepter combo allowing him to draw his library, or something like a Mind Over Matter allowing him to loot through his entire library until he can find a Laboratory Maniac, play it, and then draw the rest of his library, winning the game. His opening hand today contained 2 islands, a Mana Crypt, a High Tide, a Stony Brook Banneret, a Glen Elendra Archmage, and due to the London Mulligan, he puts a long-term plans to the bottom of his library. Now with the deck introductions out of the way, let's get into the gameplay. Bill starts us off today by drawing and playing a Cavern of Souls as his land for turn, naming Human as it enters. He then taps the Cavern of Souls to cast a Mana Vault. He then passes the turn to Nate. Nate draws and plays a City of Brass as his land for turn. He taps City of Brass, taking 1 damage to cast a Soul Ring. He then taps the Soul Ring to cast a Cursed Totem. Liking his turn 1, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph draws and plays a Windswept Heath as his land for turn, immediately cracking it, paying 1 life to shock in a Breeding Pool, dealing 2 more damage to himself. He then taps this Breeding Pool for a green to cast a Carpet of Flowers. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan draws and plays an island as his land for turn. He then casts a Mana Crypt for 0 mana. He then taps 3 mana, floating a colorless, to cast a Stony Brook Banneret. He passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land for turn. He then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and plays a Mana Confluence as his land for turn. He then taps Soul Ring for 2 colorless mana to cast a Talisman of Progress. He then taps City of Brass, Mana Confluence, and the Talisman, taking 2 total damage, to cast a Shadow Mage Infiltrator. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and at the beginning of his first main phase, adds 1 white mana due to Carpet of Flowers and Jordan having 1 island. He then plays an island as his land for turn and uses the floating white and, tapping the island for a blue, casts a Stony Silence. It resolves, and he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, wins his mana crypt trigger in his upkeep, and then draws a card for turn, and then plays an island as his land for turn. With nothing else, he ships the turn over to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays another snow-covered mountain as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast an uncounterable Captain Lannery Storm. He then goes to combat and swings the Hasty Captain at Joseph. On declarations of attack, he gains a treasure token due to Lannery's ability. Joseph declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and Bill then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and immediately goes to combat. He declares the Shadow Mage Infiltrator as an attacker at Bill. Bill declares no blockers. The Infiltrator deals 1 combat damage to Bill. Nate then draws a card, and in his second main phase, plays a Plains as his land for turn. He then taps for 2 mana, taking 1 damage from Mana Confluence, to cast a Torpor Orb. With the 3rd Stax piece this game resolving, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and in his first main phase targets Jordan to add 2 white mana to his mana pool due to Carpet of Flowers. He then plays a Flooded Strand as his land for turn, immediately paying 1 life to crack it to shock in a Temple Garden, taking 2 more damage. He then uses his floating mana along with his lands to cast Hullen, Teller of Tales. Hullen resolves, and with nothing left, Joseph passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep wins his mana crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Glen Elendra Archmage. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and plays an Inventor's Fair as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Blood Moon. In response to this Blood Moon, Nate taps a City of Brass, taking 1 damage, to cast a Swan Song targeting Blood Moon. Swan Song resolves, Blood Moon is countered, and then Bill goes to combat, swinging Captain Lannery at Nate. On attack triggers, he gets a treasure token, Nate declares no blockers, and Nate then takes 2 damage. With nothing left, Bill passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and goes to combat immediately on his turn. He swings the Shadow Mage Infiltrator at Bill, who declares no blockers, takes 1 damage, and Nate then draws 1 card. He then plays in a Darkar Wastes as his land for turn, and then taps his lands, taking 2 damage from the Pain lands, to cast his commander, Zur the Enchanter. Zur resolves, and Nate gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and in his first main phase adds 3 green mana to his mana pool due to Carpet of Flowers and Jordan having 3 islands. He uses 1 of this green to cast a Noble Hierarch, drawing a card and putting an island into play off of Hullen's ability. The Hierarch resolves, and he then plays a Glacial Fortress as his land for turn. He then uses the rest of his Carpet of Flowers mana plus 2 additional lands to cast a Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tithe resolves, and Joseph then goes to combat, swinging Hullen at Bill, getting +1/+1 until the end of turn due to Noble Hierarch's Exalted Keyword. Bill blocks Hullen with his 2/2 bird. The bird dies, and Joseph then goes to pass his turn to Jordan. You may notice that Hullen is now tapped for the remainder of this turn cycle. We unfortunately forgot that Hullen has Vigilance. We do remember this later on, and Hullen being tapped here does not impact the game in any major way. Jordan goes to his turn, and in his upkeep loses his mana crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and pays 2 mana for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then plays an island as his land for turn, and decides to give the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and pays 2 mana to pay the Smothering Tithe tax. He then plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land for turn, and then goes to combat. He declares Captain Lannery Storm as an attacker at Jordan. On attack, Bill gets a treasure. Jordan then declares no blockers and takes 2 damage. Bill then taps for 3 mana to cast a Sweltering Suns, and when it resolves, wipes the board of everything except for Hullen and Zur. Glen Elendra Archmage comes back due to her Persist ability, however, but after that, Bill passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and in his upkeep does not pay for the Smothering Tithe tax, giving Joseph a treasure. He then goes to combat and declares Zur as an attacker at Bill. On attack, Zur triggers, and Nate tutors up a Necropotence to the battlefield. Bill then takes 1 commander damage, and in his second main phase, Nate pays 21 life into Necropotence, exiling 21 cards, and then moves to his end step, putting those into his hand, and then discarding down to hand size. He then gives a turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays a forest as his land for turn. He then moves to combat, and he declares Hullen as an attacker at Nate. Nate declares no blockers, and Nate takes 2 damage. Joseph then gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking damage. He then draws and pays for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then plays an island as his land for turn, and wanting to keep up mana, passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and again pays for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then plays a Sequestered Stash as his land for turn, and then taps for 3 mana to cast a Brass Squire. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and then plays an island as his land for turn. He then moves to combat and declares Zur as an attacker at Bill. On attack, he tutors up a Solitary Confinement to the battlefield. Bill then takes 1 damage from Zur, and in his second main phase, Nate taps for 2 mana, taking 1 damage from Mana Confluence, to cast Demonic Tutor. In response, Jordan taps 2 blue mana to cast Muddle the Mixture, targeting Demonic Tutor. In response to this, however, Nate taps for 2 mana to cast a Dovin's Veto, targeting Muddle the Mixture. Priorities get around, and when priority gets to Bill, he taps his mana to cast a Ricochet Trap, changing the target of Dovin's Veto to Demonic Tutor. Demonic Tutor is then finally countered, and Nate then pays 5 life into Necropotence, exiling 5 cards, and then moves to his end step, putting those cards into his hand. He then discards down to 7, and passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays a Plains as his land for turn. He then goes to combat, and swings Hullen at Jordan. Jordan declares no blockers, and takes 2 damage. Joseph then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep, loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws, and does not pay for Smothering Tithe, giving Joseph a treasure. He then taps for 5 mana to cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and pays for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then plays a Dwarven Ruins tapped as his land for turn. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his upkeep, discards a counterspell in order to keep Solitary Confinement on the battlefield. He then goes to combat. However, in response to going to combat, Joseph taps for 1 white mana to cast a Swords to Plowshares, targeting Zur. In response to this, Nate casts a Mana Drain, targeting Swords to Plowshares. However, Joseph does have an answer, and taps for 1 green mana to cast a Veil of Summer, making his spell uncounterable. Priorities then get around, and Nate then taps for 3 mana, taking 1 damage from Mana Confluence, to hard cast a Force of Negation, targeting Veil of Summer. However, in response to this, Joseph taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Flusterstorm, with 2 copies going at Mana Drain and the other 3 copies going at Force of Negation. Priorities then get around again. Nate has no more responses. Zur then gets exiled. Nate decides to put him into his command zone, and then gains 1 life from Swords to Plowshares. He then goes to his second main phase and plays a Polluted Delta as his land for turn, immediately paying a life to crack it to search up a snow-covered island to the battlefield. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then taps for 1 green mana to cast an Arbor Elf. As it's cast, he draws a card and puts a City of Brass into play due to Hullen's ability. It resolves, and then he goes to combat, swinging Hullen at Jordan. Jordan declares no blockers, takes 2 damage, and then Joseph passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep, loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and pays for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Merchant's Scroll, searching up a Chain of Vapor to his hand. He then taps for 1 mana to cast a Sensei's Divining Top. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and pays for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then pays 4 mana and taps and sacrifices Inventor's Fair to tutor up a Panharmonicon to his hand. With nothing left to do, he gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep discards a Flusterstorm to the Solitary Confinement trigger. He then pays 4 mana to cast a Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. It resolves, and he then +1s Jace in order to mill Bill for 2 cards, and then draws a card himself, not paying for the Smothering Tithe tax on that draw. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps and draws and immediately goes to combat, swinging Hullen at Jace for 2 damage. With nothing left to do, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking damage. He then draws and pays 2 mana for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then taps for 2 mana to cast a Sapphire Medallion. He then goes to combat and swings Glen Elendra at Jace for 1 damage. Still locked out of this game due to the Stax pieces, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and pays 2 mana for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then taps for enough mana to cast a Panharmonicon. He then pays 0 mana to cast a Welding Jar and goes to pass the turn to Nate. However, on Bill's end step, Nate taps for 1 mana to cast a Mystical Tutor, searching a Tainted Pack to the top of his library. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, and discards an Ad Nauseam to keep Solitary Confinement around for at least 1 more turn. He then doesn't draw due to Necropotence, and in his first main phase, +1s Jace to mill Bill for 2 and draws a card, not paying for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then taps 2 mana to cast a Tainted Pact. It resolves, and he continues to reveal and exile cards until he hits a Phyrexian Unlife. He decides to stop here and puts the Phyrexian Unlife into his hand. He then taps for enough mana to cast this Phyrexian Unlife. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and taps a Plains to cast a Deafening Silence. He then goes to combat and swings Hullen at Jace. Jace takes 2 damage, putting it down to 1 loyalty, and then goes to pass the turn to Jordan. On Joseph's end step, Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast Chain of Vapor, targeting the Cursed Totem. Chain of Vapor resolves, and Nate decides to sacrifice a land in order to copy Chain of Vapor, targeting his own Necropotence. In response to this copy, he pays 1 more life into Necropotence, and then the copy resolves, bouncing Necropotence to his hand. Nate then decides to copy it again, sacrificing another land to bounce his Jace to his hand. This new copy resolves, and Nate decides to not go any farther. Still on the end step, Jordan taps Azami to draw 1 card, not paying for Smothering Tithe, and then Jordan goes to his turn. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking damage. He then draws and pays 2 mana for Smothering Tithe. He then plays an island as his land for turn, and then taps both of his creatures to draw 2 cards due to Azami's ability, not paying for the Tithe tax on either. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Bill. On his turn, Bill untaps and draws and pays for Smothering Tithe. He then plays a Sandstone Needle as his land for turn, and then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep sacrifices Solitary Confinement, not discarding a card. He then draws and does not pay for Smothering Tithe. He then pays 2 mana to play a Cursed Totem. In response, Joseph pays 3 mana and taps Hullen to bounce Arbor Elf to his hand. He then passes priority on Cursed Totem, and Jordan decides to cast Turnabout, targeting his own creatures. Turnabout resolves, his creatures untap, and then he immediately taps them again in order to draw 2 more cards, again not paying for Smothering Tithe. Cursed Totem then resolves, and Nate passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and then decides to tap for 1 green mana to cast an Arbor Elf. On cast, drawing a card and putting a Mana Confluence onto the battlefield due to Hullen's ability. He then plays in a Darkar Wastes as his land for turn, and then goes to combat, swinging Hullen at Jordan. Jordan declares no blockers, takes 2 more Hullen damage, and Joseph then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 damage. He then draws and does not pay for Smothering Tithe. He then plays a tapped Tolaria West as his land for turn, and then taps for enough mana to cast a Sage of Epityr, and as it enters the battlefield, Torpor Orb negates the ability, so he doesn't look at the top 4 cards of his library. Jordan then goes to combat and swings Glen Elendra at Joseph for 1 damage. Joseph declares no blockers, takes a damage, and Jordan then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and pays 2 mana for the Smothering Tithe tax. With nothing to do, he goes to pass the turn to Nate. On Bill's end step, Nate taps as a Darkar Wastes for a blue, getting an Infect counter from Phyrexian Unlife, and casts a Brainstorm, not paying for any of the Smothering Tithe taxes. Joseph gets 3 treasures, Nate draws 3 cards, and puts 2 back onto his library. Nate then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. He then pays 4 mana to recast Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, gaining 1 more Infect counter from a Darkar Wastes for producing a blue. Jordan responds by casting a Spell Pierce targeting Jace. Nate cannot pay, Jace is countered, and Nate goes to pass the turn to Joseph. On Nate's end step, Joseph taps for 7 mana trying to catch a break to cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. In response, Bill taps for 1 red mana to cast a red Elemental Blast, targeting Cyclonic Rift. Not able to cast another non-creature spell this turn, he has no responses to red Elemental Blast, and Cyclonic Rift is countered. Joseph then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and in his first main phase targets Jordan with Carpet of Flowers to add 6 green mana into his mana pool. He uses 2 of this mana to cast a Sylvan Library. Sylvan Library resolves, and Joseph then goes to combat and swings Hullen at Jordan. Jordan declares no blockers and takes 2 more Hullen damage. Joseph then passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep loses his Mana Crypt trigger, taking 3 more damage. He then draws and pays 2 mana for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then pays 0 mana to cast a Mox Opal as his only non-creature spell this turn. Not able to really do anything else, he passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and again pays for the Smothering Tithe tax. He then plays a Great Furnace as his land for turn, and with really nothing to do, passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and does not pay for Smothering Tithe, allowing Joseph to get another treasure. With nothing to do, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and draws 2 additional cards due to Sylvan Library, taking 8 damage to keep all 3. He then plays an Ancient Tomb as his land for turn. He then goes to combat, and again swings Hullen at Jordan, dealing 2 more commander damage to Jordan. He decides to follow the train and not do anything else on his turn, and passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, and then draws a card, paying for Smothering Tithe. Jordan then taps for 3 mana to cast a Laboratory Maniac. In response, Joseph taps for 2 mana to cast a Delay targeting Laboratory Maniac. The counter resolves, and Laboratory Maniac is exiled with 3 suspend counters on it. With nothing left to do, Jordan passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and decides this time to not pay for Smothering Tithe. He then pays mana and sacrifices Sequestered Stash in order to mill the top 5 cards of his library and returns a Trinisphere to his hand. Then, wanting to get in on the Stax train, taps for 3 mana to cast this Trinisphere. It resolves, and Bill then gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, draws, and again does not pay for Smothering Tithe. However, with nothing to do, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws 2 additional cards due to Sylvan Library, and again decides to take 8 damage to keep all 3. He then targets Jordan with his Carpet of Flowers trigger to add 6 blue mana to his mana pool. He then taps 3 mana to cast a Nature's Claim targeting Trinisphere. In response to this Nature's Claim, Nate decides to hard cast a Force of Will targeting the Nature's Claim. Joseph can't cast any non-creature spells, however Jordan decides to tap a few of his islands to cast a Mana Drain targeting Force of Will. The Mana Drain resolves, which means the Nature's Claim resolves, and the Trinisphere is destroyed. Joseph then uses one of his floating blue mana to cast a Shrieking Drake. As it's cast, he draws a card and puts an island into play due to Chulane's ability, and then it enters the battlefield. However, it doesn't trigger due to Torpor Orb still on the battlefield. With nothing left to do, he passes the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and in his upkeep wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking damage. He then draws and does pay for Smothering Tithe, not allowing Joseph to get a treasure. He then goes to his first main phase and adds 5 colorless mana to his mana pool due to the mana drain. He uses 3 of this, as well as 1 blue from an island, to cast an Elite Arcanist. It resolves, however, it does not trigger its ETB effect due to Torpor Orb. Unfortunately, you may notice a card under this creature. After 2 hours of this absolute Stax fest, he forgot about Torpor Orb. Fortunately, it does not affect the game, and I'm not even going to tell you what was accidentally put under there. However, if you can tell, let me know in the comments and I will heart your comment. How does that sound? Anyway, with this Elite Arcanist resolving, Jordan then passes the turn to Bill. Bill untaps, draws, and this time does not pay for Smothering Tithe. However, there's nothing else he can do at this point, so he passes the turn to Nate. Nate goes to his turn, and in response to moving to his draw step, taps for 1 white mana to cast Silence so he can die in peace. However, in response, Bill taps for 2 red mana to cast a Final Fortune, trying to be the first one to really get any value off of these Stax pieces being gone. However, Joseph does have the answer he needs, taps for 1 blue mana, and casts a Swan Song targeting Final Fortune. Nate then moves to his draw phase, doesn't have any cards to draw, and loses the game. In the dying Nate's end step, Joseph pays 3 mana and taps Chulane in order to return Shrieking Drake to his hand. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws 2 additional cards due to Sylvan Library, and takes 8 damage to keep them all. He then activates Carpet of Flowers, adding 7 blue mana into his mana pool. He then uses 1 of this blue mana to cast a Shrieking Drake. In response to the Chulane cast trigger, Jordan taps all of his wizards to draw 4 cards, not paying for Smothering Tithe on any of them. The Chulane trigger resolves, and Joseph draws a card and puts a forest into play. However, in response to the Shrieking Drake, Jordan taps for enough mana to cast a Mystical Dispute targeting Shrieking Drake. However, Joseph has plenty of lands, so he taps 3 of his lands for 3 non-blue mana to pay for Mystical Dispute, and then shows us what he has in store. Joseph continues to replay Shrieking Drake, drawing a card and putting a land into the battlefield, and then bouncing Shrieking Drake to his hand until he draws a Spellseeker. When he draws a Spellseeker, he plays this Spellseeker, tutoring up a Winds of Rebuke to his own hand. He then casts this Winds of Rebuke, targeting his own Deafening Silence, bouncing it to his hand, and milling everyone for 2. Now able to cast spells, he taps for 1 white mana to cast an Enlightened Tutor, which resolves, and he then tutors up a Mana Breach to the top of his library. He then plays Shrieking Drake 1 more time to draw this Mana Breach, and then taps for enough mana to play this Mana Breach, and then the loop is finally online. This loop is casting Shrieking Drake in order to return an island to your hand, and then resolving the Chulane trigger, drawing a card, and putting that island back onto the battlefield. As Shrieking Drake enters the battlefield, it bounces himself. This allows you to play Shrieking Drake and net 0 mana, but it essentially costs 0 mana, allowing him to draw his library. He does this until he hits a Lotus Cobra. He plays the Lotus Cobra since he has plenty of lands, and now every time he does this, he generates 1 blue mana. He does this until he has enough blue mana, and then he does it a little bit more with some other lands, until he can play a Concordant Crossroads. He plays the Concordant Crossroads and all of his mana dorks. He's then able to tap a mana dork like Priest of Titania, which will tap for quite a few mana, and a few other mana dorks, in order to cast a Finale of Devastation, X equaling however much he can, but it's over 10. Once he does this, all of his creatures have +10/+10 at least, and haste, and he has all of his mana dorks on the battlefield. He then just swings out, killing each of his opponents. What a game. Now, I mentioned this briefly during the game, but overall, this game took us about 2.5 hours. Between deciding what to do or searching up cards, this game took a long time and a lot of thought, and it was an absolute slugfest. It was a crazy game, having almost every relevant Stax piece on the board at the same time, but I gotta admit, it was pretty fun. I mean, winning helped, but honestly, playing through Stax is just an adventure on its own. To conclude this game, I do want to do a little bit of a post-game recap. However, this video has been very long, so I'm going to keep it brief. I'm not going to mention a most valuable card, but I do want to make a quick note here about Stax in Commander. Now, it's not the most fun thing to play against, maybe. Personally, I enjoy it because it does add just another level of thinking on top of just normal gameplay, but I understand that not a lot of people like it. But I want to explain my opinion on why a game like this is very engaging and interesting to play. First off, you have stacks from different people that affect different decks at the table. At the time that Nate was alive, Jordan couldn't win because he couldn't use his abilities, his creature abilities because of Cursed Totem, and couldn't use artifact abilities due to Stony Silence. Bill couldn't win due to Torpor Orb being just existing on the battlefield and Stony Silence not allowing his ramp to do anything. Nate couldn't win because he got a little locked out due to life total and just unlucky draws, and Joseph couldn't win due to the Cursed Totem being on the battlefield as well as the Torpor Orb not letting a combo like the Shrieking Drake combo pop off. So each of these stacks pieces really work together to just completely stall out the board, and the fun part of games like this, and the part that I find the most interesting personally, is playing around them and doing what you can in order to get rid of only the stacks pieces that affect you, and really being able to manipulate what cards are on the battlefield when, and doing the best you can to make that happen, so you can have the first stacks free turn, and then using those stacksy turns in order to set up your hand and really get what you need perfectly so you can make the most of that stacks free turn, if that makes any sense to you. I've been recording this audio for quite a while, so I apologize if my words are a little jumbled. I'm just here to stand up on my pedestal and defend Stax as an archetype because, I mean, I love to play it. What can I say? I can be a bit of a scumbag at times, but I did think this game was very interesting, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was a little bit different than probably a game you're used to, but I thought it was a bit of a unique game that was interesting to play, and I think it was also interesting to watch. That being said, that is all we have for this video. If you are still watching at this point, make sure to vote for the commanders that were your favorite so you can see them in the consolation match after the season concludes if you want to have your voice heard. And also, if you are interested in supporting us financially so we can improve the quality of these videos and keep them coming out regularly, remember to check out the Patreon. And if you do want to just be a part of the community, be sure to join the Discord. But like I said before, that is all we have for this video. We hope you enjoyed it. My name is Joseph. This is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.